Adam's just one of your and I's great, 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 great grandfathers. We have other great, 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 great grandfathers and mothers who were people outside the garden.
Well, g'day, it is Ken Colson here from Creation Unfolding, and I have Dr. Marcus Ross again with me today. And yeah, welcome back, Marcus. Good to see you. So
Hey,
just give
great to
us
be
the
here.
give us the quick 60-second round out on who you are, what you're doing, and what we're going to do today.
Well, hey, if anybody who's watching who hasn't seen me on your channel before, they need to be watching your channel more
Yes,
often,
that's
right?
right.
So,
We do this every time.
yeah, and loads of great stuff on your channel all the time, Ken. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Yes.
So, again, I'm Dr. Marcus Ross, and my background is geology and paleontology. I'm a fossils and rocks guy. I run a company in Lynchburg, Virginia called Cornerstone Educational Supply. That's why I got some microscopes in the background and whatnot, fixing and repairing things. We make science materials for homeschoolers, for schools, distance learning programs, things like that. And one of the things that I've been doing for a very long time is being involved in creation, evolution, intelligent design types of issues. And ever since I was a young kid, thinking about the Bible and how dinosaurs fit into them, to being a much older adult, still thinking about the Bible and dinosaurs and how all these things fit together.
Hmm.
So I've got a long, long history of interaction with this, and really just love the opportunity. Thanks so much, Ken, for bringing me along for another different discussion here today.
Yeah, no, thank you. I love it every time. We've got something. It's always something different, actually. So today we've got something completely different again. So what are we going to be looking at today?
Well, on previous episodes, you and I have talked a lot about historical Adam issues, and we've talked
Mm.
about folks like William Lane Craig's mytho-historical view. We've talked about Joshua Swamidass's genealogical Adam and Eve view. And a lot of the discussions that we've had about these things involve their theology and sometimes their science. And this particular thing that we're going to be talking about today is going on to kind of a deep dive of the scientific argument behind Joshua Swamidass's recent genealogical Adam view. There's been a
Mm.
lot of talk across a whole wide swath of areas about its theological ramifications, but I wanted to take a closer look at what is the scientific justification for his model, and is that scientific justification actually doing what he says it's doing with his model? And the quick answer here is actually it's not. But we need to kind of really tease through some of the arguments that he's got in order to see where the failures of this are kind of happening, where the pressure points where he said, okay, the model asserts this, and you look at it and you say, I'm not sure that your model can support that. So that's kind of where we're going to be going here today.
All right, great. You've got a PowerPoint there, so why don't you go ahead and pull that up?
All right. Pulling that up. All right. Is that looking good for you, Ken?
Looks fantastic.
Okay. Well, thank you. So this is going to be a presentation that I'll be giving at the upcoming Evangelical Philosophical Society and Evangelical Theological Society. And there's actually going to be a few more sessions dealing with genealogical Adam, mytho-historical Adam. There's another one dealing with Hugh Ross's new flood book out there. So there's actually this year in 2025, there's a lot of discussion about creation-related types of things at ETS. So it's going to be pretty exciting.
That's
Matt
exciting. There's
McLean,
all these different things going on there.
yeah, Matt McLean is going to be one of the people responding
Right.
in a session to Hugh Ross's new book. So yeah, a lot to look forward to.
Where is it
So
held this year? Where is it held?
one of my favorite places in the United States, Boston.
Boston.
I grew up just south of Boston in Rhode Island. So yep, New Englander through and through. I don't have much of the New England accent. I kind of killed that off on purpose. But nonetheless, if I'm up over in Boston, we're going to be all right. We're going to
Yeah.
get our car, we're going to drive around.
I sound more New England than you.
That's true. That's true, and it's probably because our deep ancestors in New England and Australia probably came from the same parts of England.
Yeah, there you
Right?
go.
That's how we end up sounding the way that we do. So the title for this is actually based on a paper that I just had published in the journal Science and Christian Belief. So this came out in the October issue of 2025, and I think you've got that in the show notes for people to find out. So if they're looking to read the full-on paper, That's there. That's just been published. And so my presentation for EPS is thankfully timed really nicely. So it's titled here, Models, Timelines, and Unfalsifiability. So this is a scientific appraisal of Joshua Swamidass's recent genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis. So there's the book cover over there, and Josh puts his hypothesis, or at least his premise, very succinctly here, right? He says, entirely consistent with the genetic and archaeological evidence, it's possible that Adam was created out of dust and Eve out of his rib less than 10,000 years ago. Leaving the garden, their offspring would have blended with those outside of it, outside the garden. And these are biologically identical neighbors from the surrounding area, and that in a few thousand years, they would have become the genealogical ancestors to everyone. So a premise of the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis is that God first created human beings and Homo sapiens via a process of evolution. So Swamidass is a theistic evolutionist, but he believes that it's possible for Adam and Eve to be real distinct individuals who were created or selected out of that population, kind of given a covenantal relationship, and then when they sin and fall, their offspring mate, and then those offspring mate, and so on and so forth, until eventually everybody in the world is connected to Adam at some point before Jesus is born and his ministry begins. So that in the New Testament, right, we can say that everybody is in Adam, right? He says by AD 1, so that's his kind of threshold, Adam and Eve are a couple from which all humans around the world descend. Okay. So to put this kind of visually, because you and I are scientists, we do charts, we do graphs, we do data. So I would try and put this in kind of a data sort of way, right? So if we think about the deep past and we think about where we are in the present, we're geologists. This is how we do things, right? Old on the bottom, young on the top. And if we just kind of have a relative size of the human population, small when it's narrow and many when it's wide, a genealogical Adam and Eve view is supposed to look something like this, right? God is creating mankind out of, in Genesis 1. So these are the male and female that God creates. And then later you've got Adam, who is created or selected, and over time his genealogical connections morph into everybody. You still have all these other people that have ancestors and grandparents outside the garden, but by the time you get to 1 AD, everybody is supposed to be connected to Adam via genealogy. So it's, Adam's just one of your and I's great, 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 great grandfathers. We have other great, 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 great grandfathers and mothers who were people outside the garden as well.
Just for clarity, the Genesis 1 people, so he makes demarcation with Genesis 1 and 2. So the Genesis 1 people are the evolved Homo sapiens, and the Genesis 2 is the created Adam and Eve, Homo sapiens.
He would say that is a distinct possibility. Josh really caveats a lot in his book. So he gives this as, I would say probably his favored model, but he would be quick to say, well, maybe Genesis 1 and 2 aren't distinct, but it's presented mostly that way. So sometimes with the book, there's just a lot of caveats, and it makes it kind of hard to say what he's exactly claiming. But I would say this is kind of the most basic distillation of it.
Yep.
Now, on the other hand, we've got, let's see, there we go. What the genealogical Adam and Eve model needs to avoid are two kinds of failures. On the one hand, if Adam is recent but genealogical spread is not fast enough, then you end up with people outside the garden at the time that Jesus is around, and perhaps even all the way up to today, right? If genealogical spread is incredibly slow.
Can I just interject again real quick, Marcus?
Yeah.
Just for sake of clarity, is the genealogical aspect. So that would be like we're all connected genealogically to people in the past. So if you have a couple, and that couple have children, and those children have children, and those children have children, all of those people at the top are connected genealogically to that couple, but they may not be connected to other people and other couples that started at about the same time, right? And so that's what we mean by genealogical. There's a connection to actual people who are giving birth to children, etc.
That's right. So when we talk about Adam as a genealogical ancestor, it means that he had children whose lineage continues all the way to the present. And so for Josh's model and for other genealogical Adam models, they need that genealogical connection to Adam to eventually link up to every human being on the earth before Jesus is born.
Right.
Otherwise, there'll be verses in Romans or First Corinthians that talk about us all being in Adam that are incorrect. So, Josh doesn't want that to be the case. That's why he chooses AD1 as his termination point. By that time, we've got to have everybody connected to Jesus.
Right.
So the the balancing act then is you've got to have genealogical spread fast enough so that it actually does get to everybody and you don't leave people out, therefore they can't be saved, right? You've got human beings on the earth right now that can't be saved because they're not connected to Adam. That's, nobody is going to believe that.
Right.
That's theologically untenable. And if genealogical spread is really slow, the only solution to this problem is then to move Adam way deeper into the past to whatever point in time might be, deep enough that all humanity eventually does connect to them. So for Joshua Swamidass, he says, we could have Adam at 6,000 BC, 10,000 years ago. But if genealogical spread is not fast, then you might have to push Adam to 20,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 years. And then it's a genealogical Adam, but it's not recent. Right? It doesn't look like it's taking place within a biblical genealogical age, like what you see in Genesis 5 and 11. And that seems to be what is driving Josh to say that Adam could be recent. He wants to take the other passages of Genesis pretty straightforward and put Adam in what seems to be a setting that's only a few thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So now you got this kind of tightrope that you have to walk. So to take a look at whether or not this works, we've got to approach the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis, I think, on its own merits. So you and I are both young Earth creationists, and we have a lot of disagreements with the genealogical Adam view for theological and scientific reasons. Mm-hmm. But Josh doesn't recognize some of those as valid, and other people might not as well. So what I wanted to do here is go to an internal critique. So let's dive into the world of this hypothesis, look at how it's constructed, and ask, is it internally consistent? Does it actually produce the results that it says that it's going to do? And in order to do this, we're going to have to look at the genealogical research that Josh relies on for his hypothesis. We're going to need to ask whether or not that AD1 date is the appropriate one to use, because that's the point from which you back calculate when Adam could live. And also, as a scientist, I ran into a lot of questions and problems with the use of unfalsifiability, both for the genealogical Adam and Eve's core propositions, as well as the way that Josh handles additional smaller level challenges. And from a scientific perspective, that raises some red flags, right? If you've got a position that can't be falsified, that stands outside of science in your scientific model, kind of wave a little red flag, like we might have a problem here. And so those are the three things that we're going to be looking at here. So looking first at the genealogical data and the papers that have been published by when Josh published his book. So within this field, genealogical studies we're interested in the types of genealogical studies that produce estimated times to when those universal ancestors might live. How far back do you have to go before everybody at a certain point is actually connected to some great-grandpa and some great-grandma, right? There are 5 papers that were the primary sources presented in Joshua's book, right? And these are really actually 4, because Rode 2003 and Rode et al. 2004 are basically the same thing. The first one's an unpublished paper that's longer and provides a lot of background information to this paper, which was published in Science. So really big publication with this. And 2003, that's a really helpful unreviewed manuscript, kind of basically part of the doctoral thesis for Rode on this topic. Then over here, we've got 3 computational models, and these ones are different. The Rode et al. Study is really interesting because it, as we'll see, it created a computer program that would grid out the world and then model populations as they moved to try and find out how fast genealogical ancestors arise. And
Hmm.
so it's really it's like a little Sim City. It's like a little video game, if you will, watching these populations and people move around in them. And then they've got progeny and stuff like that. It's a
Mm.
really elegant paper. The other three, Chang, LaChance, and Kelleher, they're doing a mathematical computation. They're saying here are the parameters for how fast things might happen, and based on this, we can calculate a number for how quickly genealogical connections are made. So one's a simulation, and the others are calculations.
Mm.
Okay, so these are the ones that Josh talks about in his book. And most especially, he talks about Rode et al. Right, taking these studies, the simulation work of Rode et al. Is clearly central to Swamidass's proposition. He describes their work at length. He reproduces their simulation map twice in his book, and their simulation started 20,000 years ago in the simulation and runs it all the way forward to the year 2000. The question they were wondering about was at the year 2000, how long would you have to go back before everybody alive at 2000 has some of the same ancestors?
Right.
That's the context for that. And their finding was that it would only take about 3,400 years before everybody on Earth found at least one or a couple common ancestors, usually in Eastern Asia. But
Hmm.
that would mean that about the time that Moses is crossing the Red Sea and bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt, one of those Israelites could have been an ancestor to absolutely everybody on Earth
Mm.
alive at 2000. So, basically us right
Right.
now.
Yeah.
So Swamidass relies on a lot of those, and as we see, he actually relies exclusively on this model to back calculate his own approach to when Adam might have lived.
Mm.
The other studies, honestly, we can't really see how they might affect Swamidass's calculations. He talks about them and says that they, provide additional ideas and influence, but it's never really made clear as
Mm.
to how or why they're doing that. So, for example, when he says here about Chang's paper, he said it used a very simplified model, and that's very true. Chang even mentions that in the next paper. He was part of the Rode et al. 2004 paper. He says this created an idealized how fast could it possibly happen if there's no barriers and no problems at all. If we got one giant mixed population, he came up with a number. It's about 1,700 years. That's as fast as possible for
Hmm.
a population of this size. Uh, so we kind of move past Chang, recognizing that's ideal and not real world. And then Swamidass notes that the 2004 paper by Rode et al. Modeled this universal ancestry. And this model shows that the ancestry arises in just a couple of thousand years, right? 3,400 years.
Hmm.
Then he says that his study in 2018, which was published in Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith, so it's a Christian science faith journal. He said he extended those results to apply to everyone alive at AD1. That's Joshua Swamidass, estimate most likely a couple in the Middle East 6,000 years ago would likely be the ancestors of everyone at AD1. So he's very clearly giving us a flow of time between Chang to Rode to his own article
Hmm.
just a year prior to publishing his book.
And the point is, he wants to connect. The point being that uh, someone alive 6,000 years ago, a couple that was alive 6,000 years ago, we would all be ancestors of that couple by AD1.
That's correct.
And
Everybody
therefore
alive at AD1 would be a genealogical ancestor. So I can trace that tree
connected
eventually down to,
genealogically. Yeah. And
yeah,
so I guess the thinking being, if they're all by AD1, if we're all connected and there's no one left outside the fold, then we're all made in the image of God if that couple was Adam and Eve.
that's correct.
Right.
That's correct. So he's providing a possible way to have a real Adam and Eve, even in the context of evolution. And the solution he's providing is genealogical connections, not that Adam and Eve are the only two people that gave rise to all humanity.
Right.
There's humanity everywhere. We just need to get everybody by the time of Jesus that's alive at that time
Yeah.
connected. The
Connected.
people
Yeah.
who are outside the garden and died before those genealogical connections, their spiritual condition is in kind of question because they're not in Adam.
Right.
And so I don't know that salvation's available to somebody who was one of Adam's neighbors, a few hundred miles away that is not yet connected into them. So, but that's a theological problem for these views, is that you've got loads of people
Yeah.
that are human but are not Adamites
Yeah.
and therefore not able to be saved.
Yeah.
The point to show here with that last quote and these ones, which I won't bother reading, is to show that Josh is making a very strong connection between what his work is and this simulation study by Rode et al. He notes the simulation, that his estimates are based on the best simulation, and that his estimates rely on the same assumptions. This is going to be very important, that his estimates rely on the same assumptions as the Rode et al. Paper in Nature.
Right.
So that means we've got to figure out, well, what are those? So this is the map. This is the simulation map from Rode et al. Each of the continents are a color, and all the little squares represent different countries that they modeled in those continents. And in those countries are populations of people and towns, and they can move from one town to another, and sometimes they move from one country to another. And then you've got some countries where you've got these long arrows. These are port countries that are moving people from one country, from one continent to the next, right? So in their study, they put in dates when, on the conventional timescale, they believe that people moved, say, to Madagascar, or when did people get to Australia, right? So Rode et al. Study was throwing in all that simulation work, initially just starting with kind of connections in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and then went, okay, well, what about Australia? How do we get people there? When did people come to the Americas? When did people get to Iceland? When did people come to all these little, Polynesian islands? And again, their question is, when in time was a universal ancestor for everybody alive at AD 2000? That's different than all the people alive at AD 1, right?
Yeah.
It's 2000 years difference.
Yeah.
In the unpublished paper, Rode actually ran the simulation with a lot of different parameter changes. And he found, with this graph shown here, that genealogical ancestors could arise as fast as just around 2000 years, almost the ideal number.
Mm-hmm.
And it would take as far back as about almost 8,000 years, 7,500 years. So that was kind of the biggest range. And you can see most of the lines are kind of somewhere around the 3-ish to 4,000 years ago. So lots of different parameters. How fast people can move? How easy is it to get to a new continent? All those sorts of things. What's the population numbers? And so we'll go through a couple of their parameters, but not too many, because we don't want to get too boring. When Joshua presents his own model in the Genealogical Adam and Eve book and in his previous paper in PCSF, what he shows here are 3 different time periods. This is present day 81 and 10,000 years ago. So this is kind of to show his genealogical Adam and Eve view. And he says it's going to take about 3,400 years to get to an Adam, right? A universal ancestor. If we pushed that back and we weren't looking at 81, but we were looking at 6,000 years ago, he still has 3,400 years. And if we were looking for the ancestors for everybody who was alive 45,000 years ago, he says that's also 3,400 years. So he takes this number from Rode et al. And says, you can extrapolate that number to any given point in human history, basically. No matter when in time you're looking, all it's going to take is 3,400 years before that, and you have universal ancestors. And that's made clear here on the bottom, where this is not about any particular time. This is just the time that it takes to get to the ancestors. And this little graph going up here is when universal ancestors start showing up 3,400 years ago. So he's very much decided that this number is how this works, no matter what time and no matter what circumstances. And I think that's going to be, not that I think, that's going to be problematic based on the way that Rode et al. Constructed their study. So for example, when we look at Rode et al.'s study and we look at their modeling of human history over 20,000 years, they started out with a fairly small human population. The estimates are only about 1 or 2 million people alive at that time. And they run the simulation with a growth And when they, have historical tie points where they think they know what the population is, the population graph adjusts. So, for example, starting around 1000 AD, there were 50 million people on Earth. And that's about where Rode et al.'s computer program has to plateau out in order to run their simulation. At the time that they were doing this, if they made the population much larger, the computer's program would crash. So what they did is they followed this curve all the way up until they hit about 55 million, and then they would keep it steady there. Now that's fine. That's okay, because it really doesn't matter too much once the numbers get bigger. The genealogical situation isn't going to be changing that much. But still, right, they're starting in AD 2000. They're starting with us and asking how far back do we go? And they said 3,400 years. Josh, however, is starting over here, and the population declines very quickly during a period of 3,400 years. And so the question is that genealogical ancestry of 3,400 years, which is applicable here as well? When you've got much smaller and therefore more isolated communities and communities that maybe are not traveling nearly so much, right? You've got the advantages of the Roman roads and the whole system of being able to travel around the Middle East. You've got ships that have sails on them that are invented around 1000-ish BC by the Egyptians. You don't have that in this time. So there are going to be some interesting parameter changes that need to be made in order for this. So again, one of the things that happens is within their model, as populations get larger, the people who are migrating are mathematically connected to this by a proportion, right? So if 1 out of every 10 people can migrate, if you got 10 people, one person is very likely migrating. But if you only have one person, you've got to wait about 10 generations-ish for somebody to migrate. Right? So that's going to extend how many generations it takes for people to move when your populations are small compared to when your populations are big and there's plenty of migrants that are able to move around. So in the study that Rode et al. Are doing, they're dealing with larger populations and more migrations and longer distance migrations. They make this very, very clear in their methods, especially in Rode's unpublished thing. This is how it works. And that means that back over here on this part of the graph, smaller populations mean that you're going to have fewer migrants, and also they're not going to be migrating larger distances because they also control for the fact that, fewer people move very, very far compared to people that move very close. Like, this is a well-constructed study. It's very, very sharp, and they're trying to be very realistic about things. So when populations are small, you just don't have the number of people to move around. You've got to wait generations for that to happen. And that means you extend the time to ancestry. That 3,400 years applies when you've got large numbers, but it certainly does not apply equally when your population values are small. And as you can see, we go small pretty fast. At 5,000 years ago, we've got a population, 5,000 BC, I should say. 5,000 BC, world population is 5 million people. 10 times smaller than it is during the period in which Rode et al. Are looking for their study.
Right. So just to clarify real quick. So what we're saying there is in that study, they're incorporating figures and facts and data that include large populations that are, in the last 1,000, 1,500 years as well, where we've had things like migration, industry, the way people travel has accelerated a lot very recently, whilst before Jesus, there were small populations, migration was very small. And so in the study, they are incorporating all these factors which Joshua Swamidass is not taking account of by transferring the 3,400 years and using that figure to start at 81.
That you're spot on, Ken. Yeah, that's exactly right. There are several parameters, 3 of them in particular, that start at AD 1500 with the age of exploration, right? The discovery of the Americas. And they greatly increased the number of ports. They greatly increased the rate at which people migrate over long distances. They have to reduce the population of the Americas substantially because there was a huge death, just a mass dying of Native Americans when Europeans came over and they brought diseases that had never been on the American continents before, right? So they make those kinds of historical adjustments as well. Those are baked into how they modeled 3,400 years, and
Mm.
those are clearly not applicable to events that happened before the time of Christ or even before the times of 1500 AD.
Right.
Those aspects of the model need to be adjusted and rerun if Josh is going to make the argument that 3,400 years works, or
Mm.
4,000 years works, or
Yeah.
8,000 years works. We don't actually know unless Josh has run the numbers on this, right? If he's run the simulation. So the question is kind of, has he? He says in the book, and this one always kind of bothered me, he said, any and all future improvements to this simulation would only reduce the time to universal ancestry. He said this was a very conservative study, and it kind of was, a very conservative study, and if we knew more, it would make it even faster. But the thing is, we actually, by the time he's writing this, we actually do know more, and there's some challenges to that. And I don't see how Josh is able to make this statement because at this point, he hasn't run the simulation. Rode et al. Did not run a simulation for the genealogical Adam and Eve. They ran the simulation for the AD 2000 people, right? Modern population. So at this point, I think it's important to say we cannot assert either of one of two things. We cannot say that the differences are enormous and therefore falsify Josh's hypothesis. But we also can't say that the differences are inconsequential and therefore the hypothesis is unaffected.
Mm.
The GAE hypothesis, as proposed by Joshua Swamidass, has not been modeled, even though he says, I'm following exactly in the train from Chang to Rode to me. I've adapted this study and applied it appropriately. That's simply not true. We don't know the impact of these differences because the GAE as a specific proposal has never been modeled or tested via simulations or by the other mathematical computational models that he mentions in the book.
Mm.
And so until such a test is done, Joshua Swamidass's proposal is an uncorroborated claim.
Mm-hmm.
It is not something that we can actually say has been tested, although Joshua has said that it has been tested and survives testing. And I'm going to say, when did that happen?
Mm.
So I'm going to skip over these just for sake of time. The short answer on the mathematical models is that Josh has cited them, but not dealt with them very much. And in fact, he's not dealt very well with a study by Kelleher et al., which is in there, that has a very long time to genealogical ancestors, like over 100,000 years. So you got Rode et al. Saying it's very, very fast. Kelleher et al. Says it's very long, but they caveat and say, but long distance migration could greatly reduce that, but they don't say by how much. They didn't run the numbers to plug in what would happen for migration. So we don't actually know where in the, say, 150,000 years ago to 6,000 years, like where that would go if we plug in migration. Others have run some numbers, but they've never come out and said, this is what it means for the modern human population. Josh has consistently said he's addressed them, and yet the only thing we've got are 5 sentences out of Josh saying, I've dealt with this at length. I don't like their parameters, and that sort of thing. It's not really a discussion of it. He's just kind of saying, you don't need to worry about their study. And, he's kind of come back to me and said, listen, Marcus, I've answered you. And I'm like, I'm still waiting. I'm waiting to hear how it is that Kelleher et al. Or some of the other studies that I mentioned in the paper have been addressed, because I've read everything Josh has written about this and I don't see it, right? There are, different sorts of problems with these that are saying, how do you take, this argument and say that we could reduce it by 45 times to get to a genealogical recent age? Mm. Show me that is plausible mathematically, computationally, and then we can have a good discussion about whether or not you've modeled it right or not. But I'll at least grant that you've modeled it. So far, we don't have anything like that. Mm. So there's problems with the genealogical literature. And I go into much more detail about those mathematical models in the paper, but they're dry, and they're just dry. The next question then is Josh correct in pegging AD 1 as the point at which we need everybody to be connected to Adam? right? He's picked this because various New Testament texts assert that humanity is universally connected to Adam so that they can be universally offered salvation through Jesus Christ. Now, theologian Jack Collins has strongly disagreed with the choice of AD, saying that it was way too late. Those are his words, way too late to be a serviceable point when Adam could be the connection point to all humanity. He especially notes that our concept of the fall is not just about individuals that sin, but also that, as he puts it, it applies to social structures and cultures. And these likewise stretch much farther back in time. He points particularly to things like human on human brutality and the worship of nature and the worship of false deities as things that have a long history way prior to AD 1 that seem to indicate sin, biblically defined sin, is around. And if you put everybody at AD1, that seems to give, way too much of a pass to a lot of sin that is happening alongside and after and before Adam. So all those people before Adam and all those non-connected people alongside Adam, we're just calling that not sin, but the same things done by people in Adam are sin.
Yeah. So again, just to clarify, so what we're saying is, if you pick 81 as the time, that means that there are actually Homo sapiens before 81 who are technically sort of not made in the image of God, because they were the ones that were created in Genesis 1. They're the evolved ones, the final ancestors of them. And so you got a whole bunch of these sort of not created in the image of God, committing sins, killing, murder, but we can't technically say that that's murder or that's immoral because they're not sort of connected to Adam. That's
Exactly. That's the kind of theological tricky problem that you run into. And I think Collins is right here by saying, if we look at social structures, we look at worship and cult behavior and things like that, those are actually tangible things that we can go back into the scientific record, right, to the archaeological record, and we can see and find these things and say, all right, is AD1 then the right time to peg everybody is now human, humans of the text, as Swamidass likes to call them. So, right, if Jack Collins is correct and that this is not a good date, then we have to move the connection point much deeper in time. So rather than everybody being connected to Adam at 81, for example, why not choose the Abrahamic covenant, right? When God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to bless the whole world through you, that implies that the whole world actually needs God's blessing. That seems to indicate to me that the world is in trouble. Sin is out there. So I would say maybe that's a better one. I don't think that's the right one, but that would be better to look at that, because that would say, okay, yeah, he's a follower of God in a sinful world. That matches what the Bible's giving us, right? This shift alone would push back any calculations based on the Rode et al. Study or any of the mathematical ones by 2,000 years, right? Just shifting from AD1 down to 2000 BC, that's a 2,000 year shift. Plus now you're in a much smaller population group. So it's going to take more generations to get these connections. You don't have as many migrants. Movement is more difficult. Populations are more isolated. All these things are compounding. And so how far back do we have to go now? Like, this would be 3,400 years, but it's probably going to take a lot longer than that because you're not on this part of the graph, right? You're not in the part that Rode et al. Is studying. Yet even Abraham, I think, is probably too recent, right? If we have archaeological evidence of biblically defined sinful behavior from like the Neolithic or prior periods, right? We might even look deeper into the past. Then the date from which a genealogical Adam and Eve is back calculated has to shift way deeper into the past. And now you're not looking at something that is recent in the sense of Swamidass's proposal.
that just
Now you're
just so
talking
that
about,
audiences can see that photo of the skull there. That's
oh yeah,
from a. Can you just explain what that is for the audience?
yeah. So this is a Neanderthal skull from, as it says here, Cima de los Huesos. That literally means the pit of bones. It's a anthropological site, Neanderthal site in Spain, and it is the earliest evidence that we have of direct human-on-human brutality. So this is one skull of the remains of at least 17 people in this pit, if I remember the number right. It's 17, 18, something like that. But this skull is intact, and it shows these two holes right here. And those were formed by a direct bludgeon to the head with a hand axe. And quite tellingly, there is a single hand axe amidst all of these bones at the bottom of the pit. In fact, the archaeologist dubbed that Excalibur, right? It's the sword in the stone. And two blows were given to the head to kill this individual. And they actually came from a right-handed person because it's on the left temple. So somebody came in from the right side and smashed them twice in the head to murder them.
Mm.
This is direct murder. And the other bones and skulls, anywhere between 1 and 8, I think we can say were probably murdered. The other skeletons are just too fragmentary and broken to make a good case that we know. But it sure seems pretty unlikely that these people were thrown in here just because their bodies happen to be around. We've got at least one murder and 17 other bodies in there with what looks like the murder weapon. So when you look at something like that, and that's on the conventional time scale over 400,000 years ago of a person murdering another person. In this case, a Neanderthal killing another Neanderthal. Now, you and I, as young Earth creationists, are looking at this and thinking this is probably something happening in the post-flood world. We're not saying this is hundreds of thousands of years ago. We're going to situate this after Noah, which explains how wickedness and sin can be found in these groups and yet them still be human. But if you're making an argument like Josh Swamidass is, whether these guys are humans or not is like part of the Genesis 1 created through evolution people. That's an open question. He kind of doesn't care. Adam's got to be way the heck up over here somewhere for him to have a recent Adam.
Mm-hmm.
But if this is evidence of sin, and sin is something that humans do, then you got to push it way back. If you don't like Neanderthals, you still have to deal with these other examples that I've got here of Homo sapiens that are as old or older than Adam is in this view, and you've got to start calculating back from these numbers. So again, if you're going to make an argument for a genealogical Adam, you've got to deal with the population changes and differences from the ancient world. And then AD 1, I think theologically doesn't work, and that's backed up by the scientific discoveries of things like human-on-human violence, cultic sites, nature worship, false deities, all this sort of stuff that Jack Collins is saying, no, we got lots of that going back over here, so we need to push Adam further and deeper into the past, at which point he ceases to be recent. You could still have a genealogical Adam. There's still the potential for this model, as far as at least theoretically you could have this, but it's not going to be 6,000 years ago. It's not going to be 10,000 years ago. It's going to be 20, 30, 40, 80. We don't actually know because, again, none of this has been modeled.
Yeah.
Which brings us then to the last point. And this one deals with unfalsifiability. I said in kind of two areas, right? The recent GAE hypothesis places Adam and Eve among what Swamidass calls a group of genetic ghosts, right? So if I were to do an ancestry test, I could do an ancestry test that would be able to connect me to about 5 or 6 or 7 generations back. After that, it's not going to be able to really pinpoint any individual that's been in my ancestry because the chances of me having any of their particular DNA in me is pretty low, right? I got half of my DNA from my parents, a quarter, half each again from the grandparents, half of that, going back further and further. So the further you go back in time with genetics, you start to lose the ability to identify people specifically. So those are your genetic ghosts. They're your real ancestors, right? It is great, 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 great grandpa, but there's no way that I could, say that I've got particular genes from him.
Mm-hmm.
So Swamidass says Adam and Eve can exist in that group, because that group goes on for a long time before genetics starts being useful for looking at large-scale populations, or did human beings evolve from other apes like chimpanzees had evolved from other apes, right? If you're trying to build those connections. He's going to be looking at this little window in which we can't see. We can't see what's inside this. It's empty. So Swamidass states very clearly, early and often, that his hypothesis relies on this unfalsifiable position for Adam and Eve as genetic ghosts, right? He says there's no evidence for or against their creation. Just none, as far as scientifically it goes. We can't do any genetic tests to find them. And then there's this very curious one that he has on page 29. I can't tell you, Ken, how many times I've read this paragraph to try to make sure that I've understood what he's saying here. So I'm just going to read this here. The claim that Adam and Eve, ancestors of us all, were de novo created is neither a scientific claim nor a scientific conclusion. So that matches his first quote up here. In that sense, it's an improper hypothesis. Okay? It is nonetheless a well-specified hypothesis that science can test.
That's a strange sentence. I don't understand what he's saying.
Yeah, it's really, really tricky here, right? Because he's saying Adam and Eve themselves, we can't prove their existence. We can't find them. We don't know. If they're in the genetic ghosts, they just are. We're never going to find them. So in that sense, his genealogical hypothesis is an improper one. Like, okay, I get that. But then he says it's a well-specified hypothesis that science can test. Well, wait a minute. How is that possible? Either the claims of a recent GAE can be evaluated scientifically, right? Testing and disconfirmation and confirmation, or they lie outside of science's purview. It seems like Josh is trying to have both here. So several critics have raised some concerns about this. I myself argued that Josh employs unfalsifiability as a mobile barricade, that he sets it up in places where there's potential defeaters coming in, and he removes it when he wants to be able to say that it's still going to be fine for us to hold to a historical Adam, for example. On the other hand, biologist Richard Buggs, one of the intelligent design advocates, he also said that the GAE is, quote, an essentially unfalsifiable hypothesis. Some other evolutionary biologists, like Jerry Coyne, have also said, I suppose this is fine, but it's unfalsifiable, so I guess I don't care, about it one way or the other, right?
Right.
So Josh has objected to this, right? He said that really we're mistaking his claims as unfalsifiable when they've actually been unfalsified, right? They haven't been falsified yet. So is that right? Well, let's recall that the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis is constructed on two pillars. One is the simulation and the modeling of where universal ancestors could be in history. And second is the idea that Adam and Eve could be one of those genetic ghosts at that same time. So as long as we got ancestors of everybody, and we got genealogical ghosts, these are the two parts that hold up the genealogical Adam and Eve. Now, the first pillar is testable, right? We've been talking about whether or not these models are appropriate or not. That's a scientific evaluation. They can be evaluated, they can be refined, they can be adjusted. But because the recent genealogical Adam and Eve itself has never been simulated and it's never been modeled, then the argument that Josh makes that it's withstood falsification simply isn't true. It's unsupported. We don't have this pillar.
Mm-hmm.
And the second pillar is something that Josh very happily continues to say is outside the domain of science. Adam and Eve are genetic ghosts. They're outside of the near-term genetics and the deep-time genetics. And Swamidass considers this a virtue of his proposal, and he compares Adam and Eve's creation to something like the birth of Jesus Christ as a singular event that science cannot adjudicate. It either happened or it didn't, but science can't tell us. I think the trouble arises because Josh habitually alternates between affirming the scientific testability of his hypothesis while also lauding the unfalsifiability of the other pillar. And that has got critics like me and Buggs and Coyne kind of scratching our heads and going, what's the deal here, right? But testability can't be applied to the second pillar at all. So if the first pillar stands, the second pillar is possible, but it's ultimately unknowable scientifically. On the other hand, if the first pillar doesn't work as far as a recent thing, the second pillar still hangs around. You just move Adam however far deep you need to go. Right? So this is interesting because myself and Richard Buggs and Jerry Coyne, we were correct, but not precise, not quite entirely accurate. That is, the genealogical Adam and Eve part of the hypothesis is unfalsifiable. The recent part is falsifiable. So we've got a term, recent genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis. Front half is scientific, the back half is not. And
Mm-hmm.
that is our big problem here.
Mm-hmm.
But this issue of unfalsifiability also hits places where where Josh is trying to bolster against critique. This is that mobile barricade kind of problem that I bring up.
Mm-hmm.
And this is seen nowhere more forcefully, I think, and more obviously than in the problem of Tasmania. So, Ken,
My backyard.
you're down in Ausland, right? And
Yep.
and Tasmania. So Tasmania was, according to conventional approaches to geology, again, we're critiquing the GAE from within its own world. So he assumes the conventional age of the Earth, etc. Tasmania was separated from Australia about 10,000 years ago. The sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age and cut off Tasmania from the mainland. It used to all just be one big peninsula. Right? You can see here with the light blue, this is shallow water. This
Mm-hmm.
is deep water. Right? This is like here in the United States, we got Florida. So if Florida got inundated and you had Miami and South Florida here, but Orlando is underwater, and there you've got Georgia. It would be
Mm-hmm.
very similar to that situation. So 10,000 years ago, Tasmania was cut off. There were people here that had walked to Tasmania overland when it used to be just Australia altogether. But now they're separated. Now they're cut off. These Tasmanians were basically unknown to the world. They were discovered by British and Dutch vessels. And when they were discovered, the Tasmanian people were, technologically speaking, the most primitive human beings on Earth. I don't mean that they are unintelligent or unevolved or anything like that, but their level of technological capability was bare bones, really bare bones. Their clothing was not even sewn. It was just loose animal skins kind of wrapped and tied. So they didn't have sewing. Everywhere else in the world had sewing. Their tools were a couple of different shapes of sticks of tools. They had, spears, but the spears didn't have like a stone point. It was just sharpened wood at the end. Their clubs were just wooden clubs. They didn't have a rock tied to the end of that. So they didn't have what are called hafted tools, which basically everybody else in the world has got.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't use tools made out of bone. They just used wood and stone. And even the stone tools were all fairly rudimentary. It was only a few kind of items in the toolkit, if you will. There's a hammer and a smaller hammer and a knife and a bigger knife. That's kind of about it.
Mm-hmm.
So genetic studies also provide no evidence that there was any gene flow recently from the Australian world to the Tasmanian world. In fact, that's been bolstered by a couple of recent studies. So the problem for the GAE hypothesis is this. If Tasmania was isolated about 10,000 years ago and remained isolated until 1803, when the first groups started mating with British folks, for example, then that means this population of human beings was never connected to Adam and don't get salvation.
Mm-hmm.
They are the exception to the genealogical spread. They're out.
Mm-hmm.
And they therefore stand outside of Christ's redemptive work. So the graph ends up looking like this, right? You've got your cutoff of Tasmania 10,000 years ago, and it remains that way until basically the present.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, at this point, there's no native Tasmanians that aren't blended. Almost the entire population was wiped out. So, but you've got this group that never had an opportunity to be part of the descendants of Adam until the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Theologically, this is really problematic.
Mm-hmm.
But here again, Josh says, well, it's possible that there could have been Australian migrants that were coming here and they just left no genetic signature. So in a sense, what we have now is Swamidass is saying now there are Australian genetic ghosts. Not only are Adam and Eve genetic ghosts, but now we have a multitude of Australian ghosts that are making migrations to Tasmania every generation or every 100 years. He kind of throws a couple of options out there and says they could be then connecting the Tasmanians and leaving no genetic evidence.
Mm.
But here again, what I find is that when you go into the papers that are cited by Josh himself, the picture is not what he's presenting. It's not this rosy sort of situation. In fact, the small population of Tasmania would make it much more likely that we would find genetic signatures of Australian migrants if they were coming over every 30 years or every 100 years and had been doing so for 10,000 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? There would be loads and loads of these. And so one of the studies that he cites is this paper by Gravel and Steele. It's a simulation. It's a computational study about how likely is it that you will become a genetic ghost. And they have a population that they run for about 24,000 years in the simulation. And they find that it's actually more likely, 20% likely, that your lineage will completely die out and you will have no impact on the community, right? You won't have genealogical connections at all.
Mm-hmm.
Your lineage dies out 20% of the time. It's only 1.2% likely that if you leave any ancestors at all, that you become a genetic ghost. And that was dealing with like one migration event happening 24,000 years ago, not migration events by a continuing group of Australians coming over here every 30 or every 100,000 years or every 100 years. And that would be boats of people. That wouldn't be just like one poor guy who gets, washed from Australia to Tasmania in a tsunami. Ye shall surely die on this trip. You've got to come over with boats.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're coming over with boats, these are some of the other problems that we run into with Josh's hypothesis. Let's see, is that the people in those boats would have brought better tools like the boomerang. There are no boomerangs in Tasmania. There are some throwing sticks, but there's no boomerangs. They would have brought dingoes. The Australian Aborigines prized their dingoes. The first dingoes showed up in the 1800s. They showed up no time before that. They only showed up when Europeans were around and then brought Australians with their dingoes down to Tasmania.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if anything, what we see is that over time in the archaeological record, there is a sequential decline in the technological ability of the Tasmanian people. They started off being able to fish, and then we see them stopping. Right? There's no more fish in the middens, in the trash piles of their societies. So something happened and they stopped eating fish. That also coincides with when they stopped using bone tools. Bone tools are more intricate, and you can get smaller things, and you can do stuff like sewing with bone tools that you can't do with rocks, right? They're not shaped properly for that. I was talking about this with my wife one time, and she said, it looks like all the old people died. Right?
Mm.
An interesting hypothesis, right? Just a conjecture here, but when you see a massive technological decline, it seems to indicate that there was some sort of societal collapse. Was there a disease that ravaged? Was there a war among the tribes that was so bad that all the people with most of the good knowledge were killed off? Is it basically a Lord of the Flies kind of problem, where all of a sudden you've got people that don't know as much as they need to, getting along and making it as best they can, but they weren't doing as well as the society that existed before them. We have seen societies rise and fall. It seems like the Tasmanians had a rough fall.
Yeah, I think that that's a good hypothesis for a young Earth there, because that would be certainly a catalyst for the fall of civilization. Would be a rapid separation from the mainland. So something that happens in a generation or so, all of a sudden they're sort of stranded. That would be a good young Earth hypothesis for why those things were going on.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, as we think about this within our own model of young Earth creationism, these things are happening on a more rapid basis. The populations might not be as large as what some of the estimates tend to think of, right? So we might be dealing with even smaller clans, and yeah, you get a bad flu that wipes out half of the adults or three-quarters of the adults. It's not like everybody in every society knows how to do everything. You usually have people who are gifted and specialized, even in kind of Neolithic level societies, for being able to do different tasks. And if you lose those people, you lose the mental knowledge that the tribe had given to them and their job of communicating that. So yeah, I think that's a real possibility. So again, Josh is saying we've got Australian ghosts and they would leave no evidence. That's an unfalsifiable position. You can't prove that the Australians made it there, but he says, yeah, but you can't prove they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
except for actually all the evidence that we have shows it's very, very unlikely that there were any Australians coming here. They would have given us given the Tasmanians better tools. They would have brought in better activities like fishing again. They would have taught them how to build boats because it would have taken boats to get there. That means that they could have brought them boats to get back. And yet the Tasmanian boats were just simple bark and reed and stick constructions that were for being right by the shore
Mm.
and not again for fishing. They were using that to, pick up clam shells and stuff like that. They would eat clam, but they wouldn't eat fish. Like I
Mm.
like clams. Again, I'm going to Boston. I'm looking forward to my chowder,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if the Tasmanians were actually being visited by Australians who had to get there by boat, where's all the technology? What's really interesting is that Josh uses this exact same argument of a technological bump when he talks about evidence that the Australian Aborigines were visited by others from Southeast Asia. He says, there's a point in time when the dingo shows up, when new tools start showing up, and all these sorts of things go on. This looks like a new infusion of migration. And so, Josh, if sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, if there was that sort of thing going on in Tasmania, then we should see the exact same thing that you see when you look at the Australian record, and
Mm-hmm.
it just isn't there.
Mm.
And so, this unfalsifiability hedge that's put up to try and protect Tasmania and say, no, no, they could still be connected to Adam. We would just never know. No, it appears that the isolation of Tasmania is complete. And the most recent time at which all humanity could be genealogical connected would therefore be 10,000 years ago, right?
Mm.
8,000 BC. That would be
Mm-hmm.
the most recent point.
Mm-hmm.
And the simulation parameters then from which you'd be back calculating would all have to be adjusted for population size, for migration abilities, for all these different parameters, and none of that has been done.
Mm.
So to sum that up then as I would say as a means of integrating the historical Adam within a broader evolutionary view of humanity's history, Josh has presented an idea that has generated considerable interest, right? But it remains an uncorroborated proposal that's never been simulated, it's never been modeled according to its own parameters. All Josh has done is said this parameter set for this population at 2000 AD, we can take that and we can put that any point in time in history.
Mm.
And that's just not good practice. That's not
Mm.
good science. So my evaluation here of the scientific underpinnings of the GAE, well, obviously they're raising some challenges regarding its applicability with regard to the models, with regard to AD1, with regard to things like Tasmania, and the use of unfalsifiable rescuing devices in
Mm.
order to try to keep the whole thing going.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, this doesn't mean that other genealogical Adam proposals are therefore all defeated. Because if you're going to take a William Lane Craig perspective or an Andrew Loke perspective and try and put Adam deep in time, 100,000 years, 700,000 years, then yeah, okay, he's definitely a genealogical ancestor, even if, we say 150, 200,000 years ago, maximum, sure. So those proposals can be made and are being made. But a recent genealogical Adam and Eve view is going to be, I think, really difficult. Any one of these challenges, from the models to the choice of AD1 to the unfalsifiability thing and Tasmania, any one of those would be pretty difficult to salvage a recent GAE with. Put them
Mm.
together, and I think the ability for the GAE to stand as a viable perspective is really just remote.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean that's fascinating, Marcus. I mean, like you say, this genealogical Adam and Eve, it can work, right? If you want to put it back 100, 200,000 years ago. But then I guess, like you said, there's a lot of interest in this, and a lot of it might be coming from sort of people who are wanting to stick with a very recent Adam and Eve. Um, and that's the problem, right? If a lot of that interest is coming from those people, then it's just not going to work,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. Um, I think if you're going to try to say that we can have evolution and we can have Adam as well, if that was my desire, I would probably just try to go with some sort of headship covenantal perspective where Adam is chosen as a representative of all humanity. He's tested in the garden and falls and fails, and somehow you get that fall to ripple across to all of humanity, not worrying about the genealogical connection, because that's just going to be really difficult, or you have to chuck it way back in the past. But that's for most of the theologians, I think, that are trying to figure out some middle ground here, they see the description of Adam and Eve and they see the description of Cain and Abel, and it looks like a late Neolithic culture, right? It looks like you've got farming, you've got the very beginning of tool manufacture with metal, like Tubal Cain, for example, as someone who's making instruments out of metal. All of this makes a lot of those theologians and scholars think this is around the dawn of the Bronze Age and a little bit before that. And so that seems that needs to be kind of recent. That needs to be like 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago.
Right, right,
And I think they're right in a sense, right? I think that the genealogy connections as well in Genesis 5 and 11, they're pointing us to Adam and Eve as being much more recent than an evolutionary perspective might allow. But on the other hand, you're getting these pressures from evolutionary biologists saying Homo sapiens never came from two people. It came from thousands of people. We evolved as a population. So you can't put Adam and Eve even at the beginning of Homo sapiens safely, because you've got other evolutionists saying, no, population model says that doesn't work.
right, right,
For you and I as young Earth creationists, we're looking at it and saying, well, Homo sapiens is definitely human, but so is Neanderthal, and so are some others. And so, their ancestor, it might be that Homo sapiens was never less than a few thousand people. But that's not because Adam and Eve were Homo sapiens themselves.
right.
Homo sapiens is a group of humans that came out from Adam and ultimately from Noah sometime in the post-flood world.
Right, right.
So we certainly got our work cut out ahead of us to flesh all that out.
Yeah.
But it is a very different model.
Right. It's consistent. It's very, very
Yeah.
consistent. And it works well with scripture. Obviously, like you say, we've got our work cut out for us, scientifically speaking. But that's why we need more and more people involved in these areas. So yeah, and we didn't talk about other issues, really. I mean, there are other issues like these people outside, right? So his Adam gets created, and he's having descendants, and yet there are these people that live elsewhere in the world that are doing the same things. They have the same technology. They're worshiping, and yet, technically speaking, they're not human. They're not made in the image of God. You're taking the Israelite gospel to them and talking to them about God. And if they reject that, then
clearly in the Bible, they're judged by God for their wickedness, for their evil, right? So, when you're looking at Abram and seeing the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the kings of the area, right? God has even said, right, the wickedness of the Canaanites is not yet complete, right? There's going to be a point in the future, 400 some years in the future, I'm going to judge these people. So obviously they're already wicked sinners, right? And under God's judgment. And the genealogical Adam view, which separates out these people until they've got some sort of genealogical connection to Adam, what happens with that transition? This seems to be a pretty difficult and nasty way, I think, of bringing the capacity for salvation into the world.
Yeah.
Because as you spread the capacity for salvation, you are spreading condemnation and judgment in greater measure.
Right.
Because there are fewer that accept salvation than there are that are under judgment.
Yeah.
And so that seems to be a really bad situation.
Yeah.
Well, why not just leave these tribes? And this is one of the arguments I made it with Andrew Loke, who takes a I think even more extreme view of the people outside the garden are not humans, period. You're only a human if you come from Adam. So for him, like, you've got these non-humans who are outside of divine judgment doing what they're doing, and it looks evil or it looks good. They're both loving and hating. They are, marrying and murdering,
whatever.
There's ritual sacrifice, and there's, merriment and celebration, probably at the same time, right? And that's horrible, but that's not sin. And they don't have souls. In Andrew Wilkes' model, they don't have souls and they're not available to have salvation, nothing. So then they die, they just, I don't know, disappear or whatever. But somebody who's doing the exact same thing is under God's judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no physical difference. There's only this, there's only this assertion by these views that there is a spiritual distinction. And that, I think, is unsupportable.
Yeah.
Really, really unsupportable.
Yeah. So lots and
So
lots of.
with young Earth creation, a lot of times, Ken, one of the things I love about your channel, and one of the things I love about you is that you want to drive a young Earth creation perspective forward, right? This talk that we've gone through here today is very much a critique, right? It's a critique of a different view, and those can be necessary, right? There are times when a proposal is made and you critique it and you evaluate it and you say it's good or it's not or what have you. But both you and I want to see young Earth creationism be able to stand up on its own 2 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a lot of work, that takes a lot of effort, that takes making proposals that might turn out to be wrong. So as we talk about this, thank you for taking the time for, a critique view, knowing that your channel is dedicated towards a more positive model building approach to creationism. So that's just, I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and I appreciate what you're doing as well, and all the different areas and facets of your ministry. So I appreciate that. All right. Well, look, I think we've run the gamut again. So Dr. Marcus Ross, again, thank you so much for coming on the channel. All right. So that's all from me, Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. Don't forget, hit the like button, subscribe, ring the bell so you can get those videos. And there's a link in the description if you want to give. Always appreciate that. And look, don't forget, pray for me and pray for Creation Unfolding Ministries. Pray for Dr. Marcus Ross as well. He's engaged in a lot of things right now, going to EDS, delivering papers, having discussions with people, debates. So pray for him and his ministry and Cornerstone. Okay, we'll see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.